Good afternoon, everybody. It's Saturday, September 5th, and as a nice change of pace, it's actually a cool overcast day here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And today's video is actually a video that I want to address specifically for the viewers and answer one of the top questions that I get in the comments, and that is, what is that black barrier that you have on your ground, and what does it do? And to answer those questions, that black barrier behind me is called weed barrier. It is a synthetic woven barrier that is made to snuff out weeds and suffocate existing weeds and prevent them from growing. But it has several uses in my garden beyond just weed suppression, and I want to take some time today to explain those to you so you can understand why I use barrier and why I've been using it for years with great success. Now, before I get into any further discussion on weed barrier, I want to clarify that weed barrier is not landscaping fabric, because sometimes weed barrier and landscaping fabric get confused for one another. And landscaping fabric has a very different purpose than weed barrier. Landscaping fabric is a woven fabric, and it is very thin and it is extremely permeable. So landscaping fabric is designed to be placed on top of soil and then have a thick layer of mulch placed on top to keep that landscaping fabric buried. And the purpose of landscaping fabric is to keep a barrier between the mulch layer and the soil layer so that airborne spores and seeds of grasses and weeds don't penetrate your mulch layer and contact the soil below and germinate. So if you have permanent landscaping beds, such as around your house, landscaping fabric is great to place on top of the soil line, and then you cut big holes inside of the landscaping fabric and you plant your shrubs or your permanent landscaping bushes. And landscaping fabric will last for years to create that impenetrable barrier for airborne seeds to try and keep weeds out of your landscaping beds long term. You can also place them in raised bed gardens and then place a mulch layer on top and cut holes in that landscaping fabric to place your annual vegetables, and that will help keep weeding to a minimum. And because landscaping fabric is so thin and permeable, water does not pond. So if you get heavy rain, it instantly passes through and it reaches the soil level and it drains very, very well. So landscaping fabric will not work well for existing weed suppression. If you just put it on top of weeds to snuff it out, it's not thick enough, generally speaking, to suffocate the weeds. Weed barrier, on the other hand, which is behind me, is almost like a tarp. It's woven, it's very thick, and it will suffocate any of the grasses or weeds underneath that you put it on top of. So it is good for permanent weed suppression, but as a consequence, because it is so much thicker, it is less permeable by water. So if you get a heavy rainstorm, don't get me wrong, the water will find a way to the soil level, but because it's so thick, I wouldn't recommend it to place down in rows in your garden, cut holes, place your annual vegetables, and run drip irrigation, because it is liable to pond in places. Use landscaping fabric for this. This is all about weed barrier. It's a very different product. So for educational purposes, this is the difference between landscaping fabric and weed barrier. Down here you have weed barrier, which has completely and totally snuffed out all of the weeds. Over here I have landscaping fabric, and the landscaping fabric, you can see right away, is very thin, and this landscaping fabric has been here for at least 3 or 4 months, and as you can see, it's done nothing to suppress the weeds under it. They are just growing right through the landscaping fabric, and they are pushing right up into the landscaping fabric because that fabric is not thick enough to block the light and the air and suffocate the weeds. So please make sure you use them appropriately. You cannot use landscaping fabric for snuffing out weeds and permanent weed suppression unless you have a mulch layer on top of it that blocks out the light and suffocates the grasses underneath. Landscaping fabric, you should do a full weeding first and get rid of all the existing weeds and grasses, then place your landscaping fabric down on clean, weed-free soil, then place your mulch on top. So not surprisingly, the number one reason to place weed barrier down is to permanently suppress and control weeds in your yard and garden. So here I have the weed barrier that's been placed down. This weed barrier has been in this place for almost a year and a half, and it is secured with simple garden staples. If you're curious where to buy the garden staples or the weed barrier, I have it linked in my Amazon storefront in the video description. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this pair of channel locks and I'm going to pull up a garden staple. And I'm simply going to pull back the weed barrier, and what you're going to see right here is completely beautiful virgin sand. So here you can see this sand is left over from when I had my house built. I moved in September of 2018, so it's been actually closer to 2 years. And I immediately put this weed barrier down to make sure that no seeds ever got in and germinated any kind of weeds. So I have this natural native sand that is the native plot to my house. So all you need to do with the weed barrier is you just overlap it some, just like you're mowing a lawn. And then in order to secure it, you'll simply place your garden staple down, and you can get a box of these. There's something like $12 a hundred or so. And you just whack it down with a mallet or this brick that I happen to have that I use as weights to make sure that my barrier doesn't lift up in heavy rain. And that is how I secure my weed barrier down for permanent weed suppression. You can see just how well this weed barrier keeps these invasive grasses out of my garden. This is centipede grass that is trying to grow over the weed barrier, but it can't. And because I have my entire garden protected with the weed barrier, kind of like a moat, I have a nice, beautiful, weed-free garden. And that has made it so much easier on my back, plus it looks one heck of a lot better as well. And here you can clearly see that I have the weed barrier wrapped around my entire yard to try to keep my garden as weed-free as possible. And you can actually see into the garden, and you can see how incredibly well it does at permanent weed suppression. Some weeds will still grow around the edges of the raised bed, but that's pretty easy. You just put on a pair of gloves and you rip them out. And then once they're ripped out, they're pretty much not going to come back. It's really easy to maintain. So here you can see how I've placed weed barrier in my garden to suppress the weeds, and everything looks really good. But for educational purposes, I specifically skipped this one row, and I left it undone to show you what my garden used to look like. This very aggressive weed-like grass would grow everywhere throughout my garden, and it would just drive me insane to run around and try to rip everything up. But it's not just the annoyances of the weeds that was so bad, and that brings me to my second use for using weed barrier in my garden, and that is pest suppression. So all of these weeds that you see growing, they are the ideal breeding grounds for pests. Insects love to lay their eggs in tall grasses and in weeds because they provide a dense mat of protection for their eggs, so predators can't find them very, very well. And not only is this a threat during the season for pests to hatch from eggs laid in spring in the middle of the summer, this is also an ideal location for pests to overwinter in your garden. As you know, most weeds do not die back in the wintertime. So even if you live in a place with very harsh winters and hard freezes, a lot of times the weed mats will stay and they will protect the eggs, and the eggs will overwinter throughout the winter, and then you will get a new proliferation of pest eggs that bloom in the spring and the summer once temperatures warm up. So if you create a weed-free environment in your yard and in your garden, you are knocking out areas that pests can overwinter and that they can lay eggs throughout the season. So keeping a weed-free garden is going to be a huge advantage to you in order to reduce pest pressure in your garden, and that has all kinds of benefits because you won't have to spray if you do spray and things like that to control pests. So weed barrier is your friend when it comes to reducing pest populations by keeping weeds to as close to zero pressure as possible. And the third and final reason why I use weed barrier in my garden is to create a warm temperature microclimate. And believe it or not, right now it is about 5:15 p.m. so the sun is actually starting to set, and it has cleared up really dramatically since I started filming this video. The skies are all pretty much blue at this point, so even with the weakened sun, I'm able to see a pretty strong microclimate effect right here. Now, I have an ambient weather WS2000 weather station that I have mounted to my garden so I can tell the specific microclimate statistics of my garden, but I also have a few additional outdoor sensors, and one of them I have here because I want to show you how different the microclimate is even with the late afternoon, early evening sun. And even right now, I'm seeing a difference of about 2.6 degrees between my garden and this weed barrier microclimate. And I attribute my, my weed barrier for a good bit of my success for my fig trees. Fig trees really enjoy high heat, and that goes for pretty much any plant out there because plants are kind of like cold-blooded animals in the sense that their metabolism is directly proportional to the temperature. So generally speaking, the warmer it gets, the faster your plant's metabolism. So the faster they'll set fruit and ripen and go through their life cycle. So adding heat strategically, creating warm microclimates in your garden for the plants that enjoy additional heat has tremendous benefits. And the weed barrier I attribute to my huge degree of success with figs, especially earlier in the season, in March, in April, when the spring sun is pretty weak. This weed barrier attracts a tremendous amount of heat to my garden, and it allows my fig trees to get a big jump start because when it may only be 65 degrees or so outside, or in this weed barrier microclimate, it's liable to be in the low 70s. And that can add a tremendous number of growing degree days to your climate. So you can be in an area with pretty cool summers and you can turn your cool summer climate into a pretty warm summer climate, or you can make your warm summer climate into a hot summer climate. And those couple of degrees, when you add them every single day for the 100 days of summer or so, or the 150 days of spring, summer, and early fall, it can make a dramatic difference to the amount of success that you will have throughout the It will make a dramatic difference. It will make a dramatic difference to the amount of success that you will have throughout the season. So those three reasons are why I use weed barrier in my garden, and I feel it has made me tremendously more successful by both choking out the weeds and making less work on my back, by reducing pest pressure, and by adding growing degrees throughout my season so I get a big jump start in certain microclimates that I created in my own garden on purpose. So everybody, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you found it helpful, please hit that like button, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe for future updates and more videos like these. Again, if you're curious where I get my weed barrier and the garden staples, as well as anything else that I use in my garden, it is all linked in my Amazon storefront in the video description. So if you use one of my storefront links to get to Amazon, even if you don't buy the exact products in the store, we get a little commission on it, so it helps me and Dale keep making these videos, and we really appreciate any help that we can get. Once again, I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope I can see all of you again on the next video. Hey Dale, is there something that you want? Okay. Nice catch, buddy. Nice catch. You're batting 1,000 today. Oh, very good. One more. Nice job, buddy.